Jennifer Wilson always knew she would never be the favorite child. From an early age, she grew up in the shadow of her mother Patricia's expectations, who seemed incapable of showing affection for anything other than status and appearance. Now an adult and a dedicated nurse, Jennifer had been raising her daughter alone since the loss of her husband in an accident. Money was tight, hardships were many, but Lily, her 10-year-old daughter, made it all worthwhile. The little girl had a sweet heart, and, despite her young age, understood the value of the little things. She loved to cook, and for Thanksgiving, she spent hours making pumpkin pie with her mother. It was a simple gesture, but full of hope. Maybe for one night, they could feel like part of the family. Along the way to the Carter mansion, Jennifer tried to convince herself that her mother and sister would, at least for one night, truly let them into the family. But deep down, she knew it was just a passing dream. The feeling that they were going to a place where they were not welcome weighed on her shoulders like a stone that was impossible to ignore. The Carter mansion seemed even colder than the last time Jennifer had been there. Luxury was in every detail. Crystal chandeliers, fine china, and rugs that looked like they had never been walked on. But to Jennifer, it was all an empty scene. As soon as she entered, she noticed the crooked looks. Patricia didn't even hide her expression of displeasure when she saw them at the door. "You really came," she said, adjusting her pearl necklace. Elizabeth, her sister, was even worse. Dressed as if she were the hostess of a millionaire's event, she looked Jennifer up and down and let out a restrained laugh. "I thought it was clear that this was a dinner for special guests." Jennifer's heart sank, but before she could answer, Lily grabbed her hand. The pie was still warm in her arms, but the welcome they had been expecting had long since cooled. The room was full of well-dressed people, glasses clinking, fake smiles being exchanged amid empty conversations. The main table, enormous and impeccably decorated, was already completely occupied. There were no extra chairs, no space reserved for them. The message was clear. They didn't belong there. The awkward silence that followed as Jennifer and Lily stood there was more painful than any words they could have said. The contempt was in the details, in the lack of a welcoming gesture, in the complete indifference. Jennifer felt a lump form in her throat, but she knew she couldn't let Lily see the pain that was consuming her at that moment. Jennifer took a deep breath, trying to maintain her composure. There was no point in insisting. She grabbed Lily's hand and, without saying a word, turned to leave. But before they could reach the door, Elizabeth let out another venomous comment. "Oh, and take that pie with you. We have real desserts here." The muffled laughter of the guests was like a knife. Lily, not fully understanding the malice in those words, just clutched the pie to her chest as if she were holding something precious. Jennifer didn't look back. The weight of the humiliation was too great. They left without being stopped, crossing the immense hallway to the exit. The cold outside was nothing compared to the cold they had just faced. They walked to the car without exchanging a single word, only the sound of their footsteps echoing in the night. When they got into the vehicle, Jennifer looked at her daughter and saw her eyes filled with tears. But Lily wasn't crying. She just held the pie tightly, as if that was the only thing that still connected them to the hope of an affection that would never come from that house. From that moment on, Jennifer knew something had to change. She would never go back to that house again, never try to fit into a place that clearly rejected her. That night, as she tucked Lily into bed, she made a silent promise to herself. Her daughter would never feel like she wasn't enough. She would never subject herself to that kind of humiliation again. The family that mattered was the one they built together, with love and respect. And if Patricia and Elizabeth chose to despise them, then so be it. They would move on. What Jennifer didn't know was that life would soon give her an opportunity to prove that this decision had been the right one. In the days that followed, Jennifer remained firm in her decision. If before she had still harbored some hope of being accepted by her family, now that was nothing more than a buried past. She focused on work, on her exhausting shifts at the hospital, and, above all, on Lily. Her daughter no longer mentioned Thanksgiving night, but Jennifer could tell that something inside her had changed. The girl, who had once been so excited about sharing her recipes, began to cook only for the two of them, without the same enthusiasm as before. And this broke Jennifer's heart. But like everything in life, the Carter family's indifference would soon have its consequences. The first sign came in the form of an unexpected phone call. On the other end of the line, Patricia's tense voice sounded almost unrecognizable. "Your father is not well," she said bluntly. Jennifer felt a chill run down her spine. Robert, her father, had always been a strong man, but time and his fragile health had taken their toll. At first, Jennifer hesitated. Her mother had never been the type to ask for help, and if she was calling now, it was because the situation was really serious. Still, she didn't move right away. After all, where were they when she needed them? When she had struggled after her husband's death? But the memory of her father, always kind and different from Patricia and Elizabeth, weighed on her conscience. She knew that, despite everything, she couldn't ignore him. The next day, she took a few hours off and drove to the house where she had grown up. When she arrived, she noticed that something was different. The mansion, always impeccable, now showed signs of neglect. The garden, once meticulously tended, was neglected, and the facade seemed dull, without the ostentatious shine of before. When she entered, she found Patricia distressed, without her usual arrogant pose. "He's gone," she said, and for the first time, Jennifer saw something on her mother's face that she had never seen before. Fear. Jennifer felt a knot in her stomach. What did her mother mean by, "He disappeared"? Her father, already weak, didn't have the strength to simply leave on his own. Her mind raced through all the possibilities while Patricia clumsily tried to explain. "He's been restless since yesterday. He was talking nonsense, asking about you and Lily." That made Jennifer hold her breath. Her mother continued, now pacing back and forth, tormented. "This morning, when I woke up, he was nowhere to be found. The front door was ajar and there were footprints in the snow." Jennifer closed her eyes for a moment. The cold outside was brutal, the snow was already piling up on the streets, and Robert, in his frail state, wouldn't hold out for much longer. There was no time to waste. Without caring about the discomfort of the situation, she picked up the phone and started making calls, calling hospitals, police stations, and even some neighbors. Her father was lost in the city, in the middle of a blizzard, and every minute counted. Without waiting for her mother to answer, Jennifer hurried out of the house, feeling the ice bite her skin as she made her way down the snow-covered driveway. She tried to imagine where Robert might have gone. He hadn't been around much in the city since his health had begun to decline. Then she remembered what Patricia had said. He was asking for Lily. The thought struck Jennifer like a bolt from the blue. If there was one thing her father had always loved, it was spending time with his granddaughter. The only place he could feel close to her was home. Without hesitation, she got into the car and sped through the snow-covered streets, her heart pounding in her chest. The city lights seemed distant, blurred by the white curtain that covered the horizon. At every intersection, her eyes scanned the sidewalks, searching for any sign of her father. The fear grew with each passing second. What if he had fallen? What if he was unconscious in some corner, buried in the snow? Guilt seeped into her mind. She couldn't lose. Anyone else? Jennifer sped along the empty streets, her tires skidding lightly over the frozen asphalt. The city seemed deserted, plunged into an almost sepulchral silence, broken only by the sharp wind that shook the bare trees. Her mind worked frantically, going over every detail she knew about her father's routine. Where else could he have gone? That was when a barely perceptible detail surfaced in her memory, something Lily had said a few weeks ago. Grandpa always talks about the bakery, where he used to buy cookies when he was a kid. He says the smell of cinnamon reminds him of Grandma. Jennifer swallowed hard. That was it. If Robert's mind was stuck in the past, he might as well have tried to find that place. But there was one problem. The bakery had been gone for years. The abandoned building was in the old part of town, an area that was seldom visited and dangerous, especially in a blizzard. Without a second thought, she turned the wheel and headed toward her old address. The streets grew darker and darker as she drove away from downtown. The streetlights flickered dimly, and the wind blew harder, whirling snowdrifts that looked like ghosts dancing across the road. Jennifer's heart was pounding. When she finally reached the right block, a shiver ran down her spine. The old bakery building was there, a structure forgotten by time, its windows frosted over, its facade weathered. And then she saw it. Robert's frail figure was huddled beside the entrance, his thin clothes already stiff from the cold, his trembling fingers holding a small package of cookies he had somehow managed to get. Jennifer got out of the car before she could even turn off the engine, running to him. "Daddy!" Her voice shook, not just from the cold, but from the terror of seeing him in that state. Robert looked up at her, his eyes clouded with confusion, but a faint smile played across his chapped lips. "I brought Lily the cookies." Jennifer felt her chest tighten. The scene before her was devastating. Her father, frail, lost in a nostalgic delirium, clutching that small package of frozen cookies. His lips were blue, his fingers almost colorless, trembling uncontrollably. Her mind screamed that there was no time to waste. She crouched down beside him, holding his face in her hands, trying to warm him with her own heat. "Daddy, we need to get out of here now. You're freezing." But Robert just smiled, his eyes brimming with tears. "I just wanted to see Lily. She makes cookies as good as your mother did." Jennifer felt tears burn her eyes. Her father wasn't just lost physically. He was lost inside his own mind, reliving memories that brought him comfort. But in this situation, he wouldn't survive much longer. With a tremendous effort, she helped him to his feet. Robert was weak, almost powerless, and each step felt like an eternity. Jennifer wrapped her coat around him, holding him tight as she guided him to the car. The wind was like blades, and she knew that every second counted. Once she had him in the passenger seat, she turned the heat up to full blast and reached for her phone with shaking fingers. She had to get him to the hospital right away. As she drove back, she kept glancing at her father, who was now breathing irregularly, his eyes slowly closing and opening. "Stay with me, Daddy. Just a little longer." Fear gripped her chest. If he had arrived a few minutes later, she didn't even want to think about it. But for now, there was only one thing that mattered: getting him to safety before it was too late. The drive to the hospital was torture. Jennifer kept one hand on the steering wheel, the other touching her father's shoulder every now and then, trying to keep him awake. The car drove through the deserted city streets, the headlights illuminating the snow that was accumulating faster and faster. Robert mumbled incoherent words, sometimes calling out his dead wife's name, sometimes saying that he needed to take Lily's cookies. Jennifer's heart sank as she realized how far away his mind was. He wasn't just cold, he was in real danger. Hypothermia was advancing quickly, and every second was crucial. When she finally saw the lights of the hospital, she felt a momentary relief, but her anxiety didn't ease. As soon as she parked in the emergency area, she scrambled out of the car, yelling for help. 2 nurses came quickly with a stretcher, and within seconds, Robert was being wheeled inside. Jennifer tried to follow them, but one of the doctors grabbed her arm. "Are you his daughter?" Jennifer just nodded breathlessly. "He's in critical condition. We need to stabilize him now." The words hit her like a punch in the gut, but she couldn't afford to break down. She took a deep breath, forcing herself to stay calm, and made her way to the waiting room. The hospital smelled familiarly of disinfectant and stale coffee. The white walls and uncomfortable chairs only added to her agony. She sat down, her hands shaking, and picked up her phone to text Lily. "Daddy found Grandpa. He's in the hospital, but he's going to be okay." After a few seconds, she got a reply from her daughter. "I knew you'd find him. I love you, Mommy." The tears finally escaped Jennifer's eyes, and she realized that for the first time in a long time, she was not alone. The next few minutes dragged on like hours. Jennifer kept her eyes fixed on the double doors through which her father had been taken, waiting for a doctor to come out with news. The hospital was silent, save for the distant sound of monitors and the hurried footsteps of nurses. With each passing second, her mind filled with terrifying scenarios. What if she had arrived too late? What if Robert's heart had given out? She closed her eyes for a moment and tried to push the thoughts away. She couldn't think of the worst. She had to be strong. After what seemed like an eternity, the doctor from before reappeared, pulling down her mask. Jennifer jumped to her feet, her heart pounding. "He's stable, but it was a close call," the doctor said. "His hypothermia was advanced and he had a slight cardiac arrhythmia, but we were able to stabilize him. He needs to be kept under observation." Relief came like a wave, and Jennifer felt her shoulders relax for the first time since everything had started. "Can I see him?" The doctor nodded, and she followed her through the cold hallways to the room where Robert was. As soon as she entered, she saw him, lying there covered by a thermal blanket, his hands still shaking, holding that small package of cookies. His gaze met hers, and a faint smile played across his lips. "Jennifer, You always know where to find me." She held his hand tenderly, feeling the warmth slowly return. "And I always will, Daddy." Jennifer sat beside the bed, watching her father's still fragile breathing. The silence between them was loaded with meaning, as if all the words that needed to be said were suspended in the air. Robert seemed smaller, more vulnerable than ever. He was no longer the firm, imposing teacher he once was, but a man who, in his fragility, only wanted a reminder of the love he once had. "I am so sorry, daughter," he murmured, squeezing his eyes shut as if fighting back the memories that were escaping him. Jennifer felt a lump in her throat. He didn't need to say anything else. She already knew. She knew that, deep down, her father had never agreed with her mother's coldness, who was also a guy, victim of the Carter family's relentless need to keep up appearances. "I just wanted to taste home again," Robert continued, turning the packet of cookies over in his fingers. "Lily makes them just like your mother. I just wanted to—" His voice trailed off, and Jennifer squeezed his hand, trying to convey some reassurance. "You don't have to look anymore, Daddy. You have a home, and you have us." Robert's eyes lit up with something that looked like relief, as if he had been waiting for those words all his life. But before they could continue their conversation, the bedroom door burst open. Patricia and Elizabeth rushed in, their expressions a mix of relief and despair. Jennifer felt her stomach churn. After everything, now they were showing up? Elizabeth was the first to speak, her voice shaking. "How is he?" Jennifer crossed her arms, keeping her tone steady. "Alive. Barely." The silence that followed was thick with tension. For the first time, Patricia seemed at a loss for words. Patricia stood at the edge of the bed, her eyes fixed on her husband, as if she were seeing for the first time the gravity of the situation. Robert, still weak, slowly turned his head to look at her. "Patricia," his voice was low, but filled with something she hadn't heard in years. Disappointment. "Where have you been?" The question hung in the air like a sharp blade. Elizabeth looked away, and Patricia, who had always maintained impeccable posture, trembled for a brief moment. Jennifer noticed this, and for the first time, saw a glimmer of humanity in her mother. But it wouldn't be that easy. I didn't know he would come out in the middle of the blizzard." "You know how he is, Jennifer. I can't keep watch all the time." The apology was rushed, filled with nervousness, but without real regret. Jennifer sighed wearily. "You didn't have to keep watch. You just had to care." The room fell into an awkward silence. Robert closed his eyes, too exhausted to argue any further. Elizabeth, who had been showing nothing but indifference until then, pulled out the chair next to the bed and sat down. "I never imagined things would come to this," she said in a lower tone. "I always thought everything would be okay, somehow." Jennifer gave a short, incredulous laugh. "Be okay? Elizabeth, Dad almost died out there because of your neglect. This didn't happen overnight. You spent years prioritizing appearances, business, status, and now he's paid the price." Elizabeth hung her head, unresponsive. Patricia looked at Robert, then at Jennifer, and then at Lily, who was peering through the door, holding a fresh package of cookies. It was at that moment that something inside her seemed to snap. Her empire of perfection was crumbling before her very eyes, and she finally realized that no matter how hard she tried, there was no longer any way to pretend that everything was under control. Patricia took a deep breath and ran her hands over her face, as if trying to gather her thoughts. For the first time in years, she had no ready answer, no elegant justification, no convenient excuse. All that was left was the weight of guilt. Jennifer watched her, showing no compassion, but also no rancor. It was not her place to ease her mother's conscience. "If he had died out there, would you have just mourned over glasses of champagne?" she asked, her voice sharp and firm. Patricia closed her eyes for a moment and shook her head. "I don't know what to say." "Then don't say anything," Jennifer replied, standing up. "Just listen." She pulled Lily close and pointed at the girl, who was holding the new package of cookies. "This child, the one you all ignored, the one you made sure to exclude, was the one my father wanted to find when everything in his mind became a blur." Lily clutched the package to her chest, not fully understanding the weight of the situation, but feeling the tension in the air. "She brought him more love in a decade than you have in a lifetime." Patricia looked at her granddaughter, and something inside her seemed to crumble. For the first time, it wasn't pride that reflected in her eyes, but genuine regret. Jennifer, her voice sounded different. It wasn't the haughty, insensitive woman it had been before. It was someone who, for the first time, was faced with the real consequences of her actions. Jennifer crossed her arms. If you really want to change, do something now, because this may be your last chance. Patricia looked away. From her, at Robert, whose breathing was now steadier but still fragile. For the first time, she saw not just a husband, but a man who had suffered the consequences of the life she had chosen to prioritize. The silence in the room was heavy, as if everyone was waiting for something. Jennifer knew her mother had never been the type to apologize, but at that moment, it wasn't words that mattered. It was actions. "What should I do?" Patricia asked, her voice barely audible. Jennifer stared at her for a moment before answering. "Start by taking care of Dad. Not for the family name, not for the reputation, but because he is your husband, because he needs you, and most of all, because he deserves more than he has been forced to accept." Elizabeth, who had been silent until then, ran her hand through her hair and sighed. "I need to change too, don't I?" Jennifer let out a short, ironic laugh. "That's up to you. But I'll tell you one thing. Money runs out. Appearances fall apart. In the end, when all this is gone, who will be there for you?" Elizabeth didn't answer, just lowered her head, absorbing those words. For the first time in her life, it seemed like she was being forced to face her own reality. Lily, who had been watching everything silently, held out the package of cookies to Patricia. "I think Grandpa would like you to have one too." Patricia hesitated, but then took one of the cookies with trembling hands and took a small bite. The taste, simple and familiar, seemed to bring her back to something she hadn't felt in years. And in that small gesture, Jennifer knew that something inside her mother had changed. Whether it would be enough to fix everything, only time would tell. But for now, it was a start. In the following days, the changes began to become visible, albeit timid. Patricia began to visit Robert more frequently, putting aside her vanity to sit next to her husband and hold his hand, as she had not done in years. Elizabeth, in turn, began to organize her financial life, reducing her exorbitant expenses, and facing, for the first time, the reality of her debts. Jennifer observed everything cautiously, without allowing herself to fully believe in this transformation, but also without rejecting the possibility. What mattered to her, above all, was to ensure that Lily would never again go through the humiliation of being excluded by her own family. Christmas came, and to Jennifer's surprise, Patricia made an unexpected invitation. "I know it. Might be too late to fix everything, but I'd like you and Lily to spend Christmas Eve here. Just the family, no important guests, no appearances, just us." Jennifer hesitated. Part of her wanted to refuse, to stand firm in her resolve to never expose herself to that kind of pain again. But then she looked at Lily, who was holding the letter she'd written to Santa, asking only that the family be together. Sighing, Jennifer realized that maybe it was worth giving it one last chance. "Okay," she said with a small smile. "But on one condition, Lily will make dinner." Patricia's eyes widened in surprise, but she quickly nodded without arguing. It was a small price to pay for a second chance. On Christmas Eve, the Carter home looked different. There was none of the usual ostentation, the extravagant decorations, or the important guests. For the first time, it was a welcoming, unpretentious place. Just the family together. Lily, wearing an apron that almost dragged on the floor, moved excitedly around the kitchen with Jennifer at her side, helping with the more complicated details. Patricia, who had always despised any housework, watched everything with a curious look, as if she were rediscovering something long lost. Robert, still frail but smiling, sat in an armchair, holding a cup of hot tea that Elizabeth had prepared. A simple gesture, but one that showed more care than any expensive gift. When dinner was served, a respectful silence fell over the table. Lily, proud of her work, looked at everyone there, waiting for a reaction. Patricia was the first to pick up her fork and taste the dish. She chewed slowly, and then, to everyone's surprise, a genuine smile appeared on her face. "This is delicious," she said, looking at her granddaughter. Lily smiled, lighting up the room more than any Christmas decoration. Elizabeth, never one to compliment anyone, nodded her approval before continuing to eat. And Robert, his voice still weak, murmured, "This reminds me of when Jennifer and I used to cook together." Jennifer felt a lump in her throat. For the first time, this dinner was not about status or power. It was about family, about love, which is what it should have been all along. In that moment, she knew that no matter what the future held, this Christmas would be remembered not for the pain of the past, but for the new beginning it symbolized. That night, after the dishes had been cleared and the fire was burning softly, Jennifer found herself outside, breathing in the crisp Christmas Eve air. The sky was clear, and the stars twinkled like tiny promises of new beginnings. She heard footsteps behind her and turned to see Patricia, wrapped in a thick coat, looking uncertain. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence between them was heavy with years of hurt and distance, but also with a new possibility that neither of them wanted to admit out loud. "I know I've made a lot of mistakes," Patricia said finally, her voice heavy with a weight Jennifer had never heard before. "I was so worried about what other people thought that I forgot what really mattered." Jennifer was silent, absorbing the words. Part of her wanted to throw all the pain in her mother's face, to remind her of every humiliation she had suffered, but instead she simply said, "What matters is what we do from now on." Patricia nodded, her gaze fixed on the snow that was gently gathering around the house. "I'd like to try, if you'll let me." Jennifer didn't answer right away. She glanced inside the house where Lily was laughing as she showed Robert how to decorate cookies. Elizabeth sat beside them, watching the scene with a lost expression, as if trying to comprehend the simplicity of this moment. Change wouldn't happen overnight. It wouldn't always be easy. But for the first time, there seemed to be a real chance for something new, for a family that wasn't defined by pride or money, but by genuine affection. Jennifer looked back at her mother and nodded slowly. "We can try." That was all she said, but it was enough. Patricia smiled. A small smile, barely noticeable, but sincere. That night, without the need for grand declarations or empty promises, something inside that family had changed forever. And maybe that was the true spirit of Christmas.